Welcome back. When you hear the name Orient, the next word that might pop in your head is Bambino. And that's because the Bambino is one of their most successful line of watches, and it's also one of the best bang for your buck automatic dress watches out there, with prices usually under $150 and sometimes just over $100. It's a watch I've gone over before when I covered my favorite version, which is the version 2 Gen 2. At the time I made that, there were only 4 versions of Bambino out there, and 3 more have been introduced since then, although they're all slightly higher priced than their younger siblings. Now there's version 5, which is a very different vibe than any of the others. There's also an open heart version, and the one we're covering today, the Bambino Small Seconds. And I actually bought this a few months ago with the idea of reviewing it and directly comparing it to my Gen 2 V2 Bambino that I like so much. Now, while I could keep both, I think in the end I'll only hold on to one. So let's first go over the Small Seconds, and then I'll tell you which one I think I'll hold on to.
If you've ever had an Orient Bambino, then a lot of this is going to be familiar ground. But if not, then the thing to remember about the Bambino is that it's a watch that really channels a retro styling, but in a more modern-sized case. If you're always wearing a dress watch, then you might want to look for something better. But if you only occasionally wear one, that's really where the true value of the Bambino shines, as they are relatively inexpensive, but they don't look it. The Small Second Bambino seems to use the same case that the version 1, 2, 3, and 5 use, so most of the dimensions are going to be the same with those versions, yet with a couple of exceptions. The width here is 40.5 millimeters without the crown, and 43.3 width, while lug-to-lug is a short 46.4. So while it may be a very rounded case, I think this does make the Bambino very wearable. And that also means it has the Bambino's notorious 21mm lug width. And if there's one thing that people don't like about it, it's that lug width. It's not impossible to find aftermarket straps, but it is a bit of an odd size. So it might take you a little more time to find one, and your selection will be more limited. The Bambino is a lightweight 55 grams, and its water resistance is a mere 30 meters. But since this is a dress watch, it's not really unusual. The one way the Small Seconds differs from its predecessors is in total thickness. Now you'd think with a Small Seconds configuration that it would be possible to make this a little thinner. Yet here, the Small Seconds is actually taller at 12.5 millimeters, which is almost a full millimeter taller than the standard Bambinos. The additional height is all due to the inclusion of an exhibition caseback, which I was actually surprised to see, as I was so used to seeing Bambinos with a generic closed caseback. And while it's nice to actually see the movement for once, I think here it might be a mistake. And this might be my only real complaint about the Small Seconds. When it comes to dress watches, the thinner the better, as you're more likely going to be wearing it with long sleeves and jackets. So while 12.5 millimeters isn't overly tall, I do think it's a step in the wrong direction. The case is listed as stainless, and it is rather minimal. Basically, it's just acting as a frame to showcase the dial. The top and bottom of the case are polished, while the side has a brushed finish. And the Bambinos always have a very interesting side profile. The case itself isn't very tall, and it's actually very smooth and flat as well. All you really see is the clean bezel and the caseback coming out of it. Now, with that domed crystal, the Bambinos always looked a little bit like a flying saucer. But here, with that exhibition caseback, it's even more so. One interesting thing about the caseback is that the name Orient isn't listed on it. Instead, it has Epson, the parent company. Now, a signed stubby, diamond-shaped crown is at the right, which is a trait that's shared among most Bambinos, with versions 1 and 3 being the exception. While it's not very wide, it is a bit tall, which does make it very easy to pull out and manipulate. The crystal is one of the key things about the Bambino line that really gives it its retro appeal. It's just very tall and very domed, which is always just really cool to look at from the side. Orient uses a mineral crystal for these, and that is sometimes a source of contention. Some would prefer a plastic acrylic, which is really more appropriate for the vintage styling they're going for. It would be more prone to scratches, but it would be easier to buff out yourself. Although personally, I do prefer the mineral, as I'd just rather avoid some scratches to begin with, but that's just me. Although if you really do insist on an acrylic, then that's where the Timex Marlin might come in handy, which happens to be a watch I've already compared to my Bambino. While there is some distortion when looking at the very edge of that crystal, the rest of it is very nice and clear and easy to see through. And that distortion is really something you'd expect with a crystal this tall. While most of the images I have show the dial to be mostly silver, technically this is the champagne version, which is a lot less champagne-y than I was expecting. But I think it all depends on the light and the angle you're looking at it. And personally, I do like the color. It has this brush sunburst effect just emanating from the center, which is really just beautiful to look at. And it also reminds me a great deal of the Timex Marlin style that I previously had. Although rather than the minimalist design that Timex went for with their automatic Marlin, this one reminds me more of a larger version than their smaller mechanical Marlins, where it has a mixture of Arabics and wedges. And in my review of the Timex Marlin, I actually mentioned that's what I thought they should have done. And I also think it's worth noting that up until now, no Bambino has ever had Arabic numerals. In fact, the only version that had numerals at all was the version 2, and those were Roman. Yet now we have both the small second and the version 5 with Arabics, which I think gives them a little bit more of a contemporary feel than the others. Although that is really one of the great things about the Orient Bambinos. Case-wise, they all look and wear very similar, but they all have very different visual appeals, so I think there's really something for everyone. Those indicators here are applied, but they're not very tall. Yet I do like how the wedges seem to get taller as the dial curves down at the edge, which is also where you see the painted chapter ring. And depending on the angle and the light, that chapter ring sometimes just seems to disappear into the distortion of the crystal, which can be a good thing or bad thing depending on how minimalist you like a dial. That sub-second dial is sitting just above the 6, and rather than the brush sunburst pattern that the main dial has, this one has more of a circular pattern, which can sometimes contrast nicely with the main dial. It all just depends on the light. Yet I think it also makes the edges of the sub-second hand just stand out a little more than it should be. It just seems to highlight the small gap between it and the main dial. And as an old familiar friend, the Orient logo is applied and sitting at the top where it always is. We also have the date at the 3, and this one actually bugs me a little. Even though it's in the exact same position as my version 2, here I think it looks a little off. It's either too close to the 3 or maybe just too close to the center of the dial. And it just seems to disrupt the flow of the dial overall, compared to my version 2 where the date window is exactly where an indice is supposed to be, so I think it blends in more. Overall, it's a minor thing, but I know some people are more sensitive to where the date position is. And one other interesting thing, and this is something I almost missed, is that there's a very small amount of text just stating that it's a Japanese movement in the model number, and it's right below the 6, and it's right where the dial slopes down. So it just seems to get lost in the distortion of the crystal, and I only happened upon it when I tipped the crystal enough to see it magnified. So in some ways, this is kind of a smart design choice, just to keep the main dial area clean. Which leads us to the hands, which I think are similar if not the same as the version 1 hands. They're in the Dauphine style, but a little bit longer and a little bit wider than what I have on the version 2. The hour hand I think is a tad short, but I do like the length of the longer minute hand. It just seems to go right to the point where the dial dips down. Now, I don't want to keep bringing up the Timex Marlin, but it's kind of hard not to, as the silver sunburst pattern there is very similar to what we have here. And it's a look and effect I just loved there. So it's no surprise that I really like it here on the small seconds as well. And I believe the Marlin was actually one of the first watches I looked at under macro conditions. And while the dial there looked beautiful in person, under magnification there were a lot more scratches and dings than I liked. So it's nice to see here that the Bambino Small Seconds just looks great under macro. Everything just looks nice and crisp, with maybe just a few minor imperfections. Yet considering the price, it's actually pretty impressive. Now, as far as that small seconds dial goes, generally, I think people know instantly on whether or not they like a small seconds. If you're someone that always loves watching a second hand just sweep the dial, then a small seconds might not be for you. Yet I think it really simplifies the dial and just adds a bit of a classic element here, which in many ways is really what you want for a dress watch. Not to mention that I think the small seconds configuration here really helps it stand out from the rest of the Bambino line. Movement-wise, we have Orient's in-house F6222. which is really a variant of the F6724, which is standard throughout the Bambino line. And for the first time, you can actually see the movement from the rear. Now that movement is pretty much everything you want at this price, and I think it's comparable to a Seiko NH35A. It is a standard beat rate, 40-hour power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. Accuracy should also be comparable, and that's always luck of the draw, but here I was actually getting close to 10 seconds a day. Which leads us to the leather strap, and if you know Bambinos, then you pretty much know what to expect here. The strap is, well, it's okay. It's not great, but it's also not bad. It's just okay, and it's a dark red-brown alligator-style leather strap here, which does taper down as you get to the signed buckle. The leather is okay, if not a bit stiff. So basically, it'll last you for a bit, and it's okay for now. And once you actually break it in, it will wear nicely on it. Even though the Bambino is a little wide, well, wide as some dress watches go, the shorter lug-to-lug here makes it very wearable, while still giving it a great presence. And if you're wondering what that furry blur just was, well, here's a better look at why my arm has had scratches for the last month. Now I think this is true of all Bambinos, not just a small second, but if you really like it, and you do find a good replacement strap, it's definitely worth getting one. And I'll just break away from little Odin here to show you what I have on my version 2, which I think looks great on this small second version as well. I've found that a good strap just turns it into a whole new watch, just in terms of look and feel. 21mm straps can be hard to find, but they're not impossible.
Overall, I think the Bambino Small Seconds is the best looking Bambino currently available. And I can't help but think that maybe Timex should have adopted a design similar to this than what they came up with for the automatic Marlin. Yet I do think Orient stumbled in the design here. In my opinion, the most important dimension for a dress watch is total height or thickness. And while I think the original Bambino is okay for thickness, I think they could have actually improved upon it here with the small second design, and possibly make it a little thinner. Yet they actually wound up making it a little taller with the inclusion of that exhibition case back. That's not to say that the small seconds is too tall, it's actually quite reasonable. I just think they could have done a better job. And I do wonder if you could swap case backs from the original Bambino to the small seconds and vice versa. But that's something someone else is going to have to try, as I have decided to sell this one and keep my Gen 2 V2 Bambino. It's hard to explain, but I really love the combination of this one, with its stainless steel case and rose gold hands, all mixed together with that very detailed chaptering. It's really just a combination that you don't see very often in today's contemporary dress watches. Anyway, let me know in a comment what you think about the Bambino Small Seconds, or if there are any other dress watches in this price range I should take a look at. And I'm especially interested in some smaller Seiko 5 dress watches to review later this year. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.